They told me a wedding was flexible and movable. Piper's launch party, they claimed, was real life and too important to reschedule. So I got married beneath live oaks with a handmade cedar arch and more empty place cards than guests. 3 weeks later, one quiet honeymoon photo from Bora Bora turned my family's silence into panic. They had not just skipped a small wedding, they had skipped the woman who was about to become impossible to ignore. My name is Noelle Langley. A wedding can be moved, my sister Piper told me, her voice smooth and entirely devoid of apology as she stirred her iced coffee with a glass straw. Investor timing cannot. She had just informed me that the luxury brand launch party for her new lifestyle beverage, a venture fueled entirely by her husband's capital and her own relentless need to be perceived as a founder, was scheduled for the exact same Saturday as my wedding. At the exact same hour, we were sitting in the solarium of her $5 million home, the sharp afternoon sunlight bouncing off the imported marble floors, and she delivered the news not as a confession, but as an administrative update. I was 32 years old, for 32 years. I had been the practical one, the quietly strong daughter, the one who never threw a tantrum, never demanded the spotlight, and never made a mess that someone else had to clean up. In the Langley family ecosystem, my role was permanently fixed. I was the daughter who would simply understand. If Piper needed the master bedroom on family vacations because she brought more luggage, I understood. If my parents missed my college graduation because Piper had a minor panic attack over a bad breakup and needed them to fly out to comfort her, I understood. My family did not just love Piper Langley Hale. They orbited her. She had turned social climbing into a lifestyle and brilliantly branded it as ambition. But her real power came from the man she married. Conrad Hale was a glossy boutique hotel developer. His suits looked like they were poured onto his frame, tailored to within an inch of their life. He spoke almost exclusively in terms of leverage, assets, and optics. His money, his connections, and his casual promises of access had slowly, insidiously made the entire Langley clan financially and socially dependent on him. My father played golf at clubs he could never afford, because Conrad paid the initiation fee. My mother hosted charity committees that only accepted her because she was Conrad Hale's mother-in-law. Even my extended family, the aunts who wanted their kids in the right prep schools, the cousins looking for summer internships, knew that the road to success was paved by Conrad's approval. And Conrad's approval belonged exclusively to Piper. When Piper announced her launch date, I was not shocked. Piper doing something breathtakingly selfish was just standard procedure. What shattered me, what actually fractured something deep and vital inside my chest, was the absolute silence that followed. My parents, my aunts, my cousins, and even my father, who had stood in my kitchen a year ago and promised with tears in his eyes to walk me down the aisle, all looked away. They followed Piper without a single protest. They weighed a modest coastal wedding against a glittering rooftop party funded by Conrad, and they made their choice. Not one of them told Piper she was out of line. Not one of them suggested she change her date. My father cleared his throat and muttered something about how crucial this financial quarter was for Conrad's portfolio, as if that excused the fact that he was abandoning his youngest daughter on the day she was getting married. They were skipping out on me, but they were also skipping out on Silas. Silas Reed was the man I was going to marry. He was a historic restoration carpenter, a man whose hands possessed the exactitude and patience to rebuild century-old antique staircases from splintered, water-damaged ruins. He was steady, observant, and deeply grounding. He did not talk about what he was going to do. He simply did it. But to my family, who only valued things that came with a reserved VIP table or a glowing press release, he was just some guy who works with wood. They did not see the quiet dignity in his work, just as they had never seen the quiet dignity in my life. They looked at his calloused hands, his work boots, and his quiet demeanor and saw a lack of ambition. I looked at him and saw the only structurally sound thing in my world. They thought my life was small. They assumed that because I did not demand attention, I had nothing worth paying attention to. They could not have known that just 3 weeks after they left my ceremony empty, Their phones would light up with a single honeymoon photograph. They would see an overwater villa in Bora Bora that even Conrad's money could not easily secure, and their comfortable, justified silence would turn into panicked, frantic desperation. The same relatives who could not spare a Saturday afternoon for my vows would soon be flooding my voicemail, sending double texts, and demanding to know how I was suddenly moving in circles they could not buy their way into. But this is not a story about screaming, glass-throwing revenge. There were no slashed tires, no dramatically overturned tables, no vicious public shouting matches. I did not set out to destroy my family. I simply stopped making myself small for people who were addicted to a hierarchy that I no longer cared to climb. I let them make their choices, and then I let them survive the consequences without me to absorb the impact. The collapse did not happen all at once. The final fracture was on that wedding day beneath the live oaks. But the first real fault line, the one that became absolutely impossible to ignore, cracked open exactly 6 months earlier, at a family dinner I should have walked away from. It was a Friday evening in early October. The air outside was turning crisp, but inside the private dining room of Conrad's newest flagship restaurant, the atmosphere was suffocatingly curated. We were supposed to be celebrating my engagement. Silas and I had been engaged for exactly 2 weeks. We had wanted a quiet dinner at our favorite neighborhood seafood spot, but my mother, Elise, insisted that a Langley milestone had to be recognized properly. Properly, in her vocabulary, meant highly visible to people who mattered. Conrad had secured the private room. Piper had selected the tasting menu. I was the guest of honor in name only, sitting next to Silas while the conversation swirled entirely around Piper's upcoming brand launch. "It is just so exhausting," Piper sighed, adjusting a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the low light of the chandelier. "The packaging designers simply do not understand the aesthetic. I told them I need minimalist opulence. Not just clean lines, expensive clean lines." "You have such an eye for it, darling," my mother said, leaning forward with rapt attention. "No one understands luxury like you do. It is practically a talent." My father, Warren, nodded along, swirling his bourbon. He had recently traded his reliable sedan for a luxury import he was leasing at an exorbitant rate, all to ensure he did not look out of place when parking at Conrad's office. "Conrad, how are the permits looking for the new coastal property I mentioned the project to the guys at the club? And they are practically begging for an early look. I told them you might be open to a few select local investors." Conrad looked at my father with the mild irritation of a man swatting away a gnat. "Handling it, Warren," Conrad said smoothly. He did not look at my father when he spoke. He rarely did. He treated my parents like eager interns. He turned his gaze toward Silas, who was quietly cutting his steak, entirely unbothered by the performative wealth surrounding us. "So, Silas," Conrad began, a patronizing smirk playing on his lips. "Still hammering nails down at that old Victorian on 4th Street must be nice. Working with your hands. No corporate stress, no real stakes, just you and the wood." I stiffened. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a defensive anger spiking in my chest. Silas merely paused, resting his knife on the edge of his plate. He did not flush. He did not bristle. He looked at Conrad with the calm, level gaze of a man who knew exactly how a structure was built and exactly how easily it could fall. "There is a fair amount of stress when you are ensuring a 150-year-old load-bearing wall does not collapse," Silas said, his voice even and rich. "But you are right. The stakes are different. I prefer building things meant to last." It was a subtle parry, a quiet assertion of worth that did not require a price tag. But Conrad's smile tightened. He was not used to men who were unaffected by him. Piper, sensing a shift in the spotlight, immediately swooped in to protect her husband's ego. "Well, it is certainly quaint," Piper said, wrapping her condescension in a sweet, airy tone. "But Noelle, really, have you thought about what happens when he gets too old for manual labor? You work at that little civic tech startup. It is sweet that you both have your passions, but the real world requires a bit more ambition." "Halcyon is not a little startup," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "We handle coastal resilience and emergency logistics." Right, right. The weather maps thing." Piper dismissed it with a wave of her manicured hand. "I just mean, you have to think about the future. You are 32. You cannot just play it safe forever," my mother chimed in, perfectly on cue. "Piper is just looking out for you, Noelle. She just wants you to be comfortable, like she and Conrad are." I looked across the table. I looked at my mother, who measured her worth entirely by her proximity to Piper's wealth, living for the invitations and the curated holiday tables that Conrad's money provided. I looked at my father, who had built his pride around appearances and traded his dignity for country club connections, and I looked at Piper, who needed me to be small so she could feel large. I looked at Silas. He gave me a barely perceptible nod, a silent grounding force. He did not need to defend his pride, because his pride was not built on sand. That dinner was the moment I realized they were not just oblivious. They were actively invested in my mediocrity. If I was successful, if my life held weight and beauty, it challenged the hierarchy they relied on to feel secure. They needed me to be the reliable, unremarkable background character in the movie of Piper's life. 6 months later, they would prove just how far they were willing to go to keep me there. They would abandon my wedding. They would leave my handmade cedar arch standing in front of dozens of empty chairs. But sitting at that dinner table, watching them toast to Piper's imaginary struggles while actively ignoring my actual joy, I felt the last lingering threads of my familial guilt dissolve. I did not say anything else that night. I smiled. I ate my overpriced food, and I let them believe they had won. I let them believe I was exactly who they thought I was: the practical daughter, the quiet sister, the one who would always bend. It was the last time I would ever offer them that comfort. Growing up, the division of labor in the Langley household was absolute and entirely unspoken. Piper was the headline act, the undeniable main event, and I was the reliable stagehand keeping the production from falling apart. The pattern was etched into our family dynamic long before Conrad Hale arrived with his checkbook. If Piper threw a lavish backyard summer solstice party that left the lawn trampled and the kitchen looking like a disaster zone, my mother would praise her for being an impeccable hostess, kiss her on the cheek, and then hand me a box of heavy-duty trash bags. When Piper turned 25, she demanded a formal gala with 200 guests. She spent 4 hours posing for professional photographers, while I spent the evening in the catering tent, making sure the waitstaff had enough ice and hauling away empty champagne bottles until 2 in the morning. I was never thanked. It was simply expected. My father, Warren, was the architect of this hollow reality. He was a man who believed a person's worth could be calculated entirely by the logo stamped on their steering wheel or the zip code listed on their mortgage. He had spent his entire adult life hovering anxiously on the edge of real wealth, always reaching, always performing. It was not until Piper married Conrad that my father finally felt he had arrived. Suddenly, he was casually dropping Conrad's name at the country club, acting as though he had earned his place in the men's grill rather than being dragged there by his son-in-law's coattails. He started leasing cars that cost him thousands of dollars a month just so he would not look out of place in the valet line. My mother, Elise, was the other half of that same tragic coin. She lived for committee appointments, curated holiday centerpieces, and the intoxicating, desperate thrill of being adjacent to money. To my mother, a successful Tuesday meant being seen having a $40 salad with women whose husbands ran hedge funds. She curated our family image with the ruthless precision of a museum director, and in her gallery, Piper was the masterpiece. I was just the sensible frame holding it all up. They did not understand what I did for a living, and I vastly preferred it that way. I worked as a senior logistics architect at Halcyon Civic Systems, a coastal resilience firm that operated out of a retrofitted warehouse near the docks. For the last 5 years, my team and I had been building TideMap. It was a sophisticated evacuation and infrastructure planning platform designed to prevent coastal cities from collapsing during extreme weather events. My drive for this work was not abstract, nor was it born from a desire to climb a corporate ladder. When I was 16 years old, a Category 4 hurricane tore directly through our coastal county. My family was caught in the frantic, disorganized evacuation gridlock. I remember sitting in the back seat of my father's sweltering sedan for 17 hours on Interstate 95. The temperature outside was 95 degrees. The gas gauge was dropping toward empty, and the radio broadcast kept spitting out conflicting escape routes. I remember watching my parents panic. I remember the terrifying realization that the authorities in charge had no idea what they were doing. I never forgot what chaos feels like when municipal systems fail. I joined Halcyon when it was just 12 people eating cold takeout in a leased office space. Because I was early, and because my coding architecture became the foundation of the TideMap software, I held a 4.5% equity stake in the company. But I never mentioned my shares, my title, or the actual scope of my work at family dinners. I kept it entirely to myself, partly out of a deeply ingrained caution, and partly because I knew my family. If my parents could not photograph my job, brag about it to their wealthy friends, or wear it to a charity gala, it simply did not exist to them. Coastal resilience was not glamorous. It was just essential. And in the Langley family, essential was a synonym for invisible. I did not meet the love of my life at a rooftop mixer or a country club fundraiser. I met Silas Reed on a humid afternoon in late August, surrounded by the sharp scent of sawdust and old pine. I had purchased a small, historic cottage near the water, and a recent tropical storm had completely crushed the wraparound porch. Silas came highly recommended for historic architectural restoration. The first time I saw him, he was standing on my ruined porch, running his calloused hand along a splintered joist, reading the grain of the wood like a topographic map. He was steady. He was observant. He possessed a quiet, grounded masculinity that did not require swagger, loud volume, or performative dominance to make itself known. He did not hand me a glossy brochure or give me a slick sales pitch. He just looked me in the eye and told me the foundation was good. The rot was isolated, and he could save the original aesthetic if I gave him 3 weeks. Over those 21 days, I watched him work. He rebuilt the antique railings with a level of care that felt almost foreign to me. He worked with hand planes and chisels, measuring every angle twice, ensuring every joint was structurally perfect. In a world, and specifically in a family where everything was about the fastest route to the flashiest result, Silas took his time. He fixed broken things, and he did not demand an audience or a round of applause for doing it. I brought him iced tea. We started talking about architecture and endurance, and I found myself trusting him instantly. He was the most authentic person I had ever met. By then, the pattern was impossible to miss. At a later barbecue at my parents' house, Conrad mocked Silas again. Piper wrapped her contempt in sweetness, and my father laughed along as if he were auditioning for Conrad's approval. Nothing about the evening surprised me except how calm I felt seeing it clearly. My family respected polish, not substance, and they would never value what could not be bought. Silas and I decided on the second Saturday in October. We did not want a ballroom, and we certainly did not want the sterile, manufactured grandeur that my family usually demanded for their gatherings. We found a small, historic property near the water in Beaufort, North Carolina. It had peeling white paint that Silas promised to help the owners touch up, sprawling live oak trees draped in Spanish moss, and a view of the marsh that turned into a sea of liquid gold right at dusk. We envisioned a ceremony that felt intimate and true. I spent evenings hand-lettering oyster shells for place cards. Silas spent his weekends in his workshop, carefully joining beams of salvaged cedar to build the arch we would stand beneath. I gave my family 8 months of notice. I drove to my parents' house on a Sunday morning, holding a folder of fabric swatches and a printed itinerary. My father was standing by the kitchen island, nursing a cup of black coffee. When I told him the date and the location, his eyes softened in a way that felt entirely genuine. He pulled me into a hug, kissing the top of my head. "I will be proud to walk you down that aisle," he said, his voice thick with what I thought was real emotion. Wild horses could not drag me away. I let myself believe him. I let myself soften. Piper's reaction, however, was the first true warning sign. When I told her the plans, she did not immediately try to hijack the floral arrangements. She did not suggest a more prestigious venue or complain that Beaufort was too far from a major airport. She simply smiled a flat, measured smile, sipped her sparkling water, and said it sounded incredibly quaint. For my sister, who treated every family event as an opportunity to assert her dominance, the absence of an opinion was terrifying. It was the calm of a predator that had already locked the doors from the outside. The trap snapped shut 6 weeks later. I was sitting at my desk at Halcyon, reviewing a localized flooding projection on TideMap, when my phone vibrated. It was my Aunt Clara. She was calling to ask about hotel blocks, but her tone was deeply confused. "Noelle, darling, I just need to clarify the logistics," Clara said, her voice echoing slightly on speakerphone. "Are you and Piper splitting the weekend because Charlotte is a solid 4 hours from Beaufort, and Piper's formal invitations just arrived? Her big founder-era launch party for that new botanical drink is scheduled for the second Saturday in October, at exactly 4 in the afternoon." The blood drained from my face, pooling somewhere near my ankles. My wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin at exactly 4 in the afternoon on the second Saturday in October. Piper would later look me in the eye and deliver her cold, rehearsed line about investor timing and movable weddings, but the truth of her malice was far more deliberate. She had not been forced into that date by mysterious corporate backers. I found out the exact sequence of events 48 hours after Clara's phone call. Thanks to my youngest cousin, Mia, who had too much of a conscience to keep quiet. Mia sent me 3 screenshots from a private family group chat. I was, of course, excluded from this chat. The timestamps on the messages were from 2 weeks after I had formally announced my wedding date. Piper had sent a glossy, digital save the date to the extended family, followed by a long, manipulative paragraph. "Conrad and I are at a crucial tipping point," Piper had written. "The investors are flying in, and it is absolutely vital that we show a united, powerful family front. I know Noelle has her little beach thing planned for that day, but this launch dictates our entire financial future. Conrad is keeping a very close eye on who shows up to support us. We really need our inner circle on that rooftop." It was a masterclass in weaponized guilt. She framed my wedding as a trivial vacation, a little beach thing, and positioned her party as a high-stakes loyalty test. But Piper's emotional manipulation was only half the strategy. The real enforcement came from Conrad. Conrad Hale did not scream or make demands. He operated like a cartel boss in a tailored linen suit, using quiet leverage to remind everyone exactly where their bread was buttered. According to Mia, Conrad had taken my Uncle David out for an expensive lunch and casually mentioned that he was reviewing the accounting contracts for his new hotel developments. Uncle David's firm desperately needed that account. Conrad then reminded my father that the annual dues for the country club, the ones Conrad quietly subsidized, were coming up for renewal in November. He made a few calls to my cousins, dangling potential internships and introductions to venture capitalists, all while casually mentioning how much it would mean to Piper to see them in Charlotte. They were not choosing a launch party over a wedding, they were choosing financial security over me. The most painful blow, however, was delivered by my own mother. Elise called me on a Tuesday evening. She sounded breezy, light, and entirely detached from reality. "Noelle, sweetie, we are in a bit of a scheduling bind," she began, using the same tone she used to negotiate a later seating time at a restaurant. Piper's investors absolutely locked her into that Saturday. Her hands are tied. Now, since your event is just family and a few friends down by the water, can you be flexible just this once? Why do we not just push your ceremony to the first weekend in November? The weather is actually much better then. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the hardwood floor. My dress was altered. The venue was paid for. Silas had already hand-carved our names into the cedar arch, and my mother was asking me to reschedule the most important day of my life as if it were a conflicting brunch reservation. She wanted me to neatly fold myself away, to erase my own joy, simply to spare the family the embarrassment of admitting they were terrified of my brother-in-law. "I cannot move my wedding, Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm. It is a marriage, not a dentist appointment. Oh, please do not be dramatic, she sighed, a sharp edge of irritation bleeding through her polite veneer. Piper is building an empire. You are marrying a carpenter. You have the flexibility. You just refuse to use it because you are being stubborn. She hung up before I could respond. The silence in my bedroom was absolute, heavy, and ringing with finality. I did not call my father to beg him to keep his promise. I did not call Piper to scream at her. I did not confront Conrad about his financial blackmail. I realized in that moment that begging them to love me would only prove to them that they held the power to destroy me. Instead, I opened the main family group chat. My fingers were completely steady as I typed out one final, dignified message. I refused to let them paint me as the hysterical, jealous sister. Silas and I are moving forward with our wedding, I wrote. The ceremony remains at 4 p.m. on the second Saturday in October, at the Beaufort property. We understand that some of you will choose to be in Charlotte. We will miss you, but we accept your decision. No further discussion is needed. I pressed send, then. I sat back and watched the RSVPs collapse like a row of dominoes. Over the next 10 days, my phone buzzed with weak excuses, hollow apologies, and cowardly retractions. Aunts suddenly had migraines. Cousins claimed they had inescapable work emergencies. Even my father sent a vague, cowardly text about a conflicting board meeting, utterly incapable of admitting he was simply following Conrad's orders. The guest list dropped from 60 to 50, then to 30, and finally settled at fewer than 20 people. It was a brutal, agonizing process, like watching a house burn down beam by beam. But as the numbers dwindled, a strange, crystalline clarity settled over me. This was my first true turning point. For my entire life, I had closed my eyes to the ugliness of my family's conditional love, pretending their neglect was just a quirky personality trait. I decided, right then and there, that I would no longer look away. I would keep my eyes wide open. I would witness the truth of who they were clearly, without making excuses for them, even if it broke my heart into pieces. I would stand under that cedar arch, and I would count exactly who showed up. The morning of my wedding broke with a cool silver light that spilled across the coastal marshlands. There was no chaotic bridal suite, no frantic rushing, no clinking of champagne glasses. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the ocean breeze rattling the window panes. My phone vibrated on the wooden nightstand at 8 o'clock. The caller ID displayed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times before I picked up, pressing the cold glass against my ear. I did not say hello. I just waited. "Sweetheart," my father said. His voice was thick, trembling with the distinct cadence of a coward trying desperately to sound gentle. "I am so sorry. I cannot make the drive down today." I sat on the edge of the bed, tracing the quilted pattern of the blanket with my index finger. I did not speak. Conrad had a last-minute push with the regional press. My father continued, rushing his words to fill the suffocating silence I was offering him. "Piper needs us on the rooftop. She is in a panic over the investor turnout. This launch changes her future. It is a critical turning point for the whole family's portfolio. You know I love you. You know I would be there if I could." I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not hurl the phone across the room or curse him. Instead, a profound, icy stillness settled over my bones. The reaction hit far harder than tears ever could have. If I had cried, I would have given him a performance of grief that he could later frame as an overreaction. By remaining perfectly silent, I forced him to sit alone with the ugliness of his own choice. "Have a good afternoon, Dad," I said softly, my voice devoid of any jagged edges. I hung up the phone before he could reply. Stepping outside onto the back lawn, the venue was a study in breathtaking, melancholic beauty. The wind off the marsh carried the sharp scent of salt and decaying cordgrass. Ancient live oaks draped in heavy gray Spanish moss formed a natural cathedral ceiling above the grass. The florist had delivered the white florals early, placing loose, wild arrangements of hydrangeas and sea holly in heavy stone vases, waiting for the dusk candlelight to illuminate them. On a long wooden table near the reception area, I arranged the place cards. I had spent countless evenings hand-lettering the names of my family members onto smooth, bleached oyster shells. Now, I separated them. I placed the shells for Silas's family and our friends on the main display. The rest, more than 50 hand-painted shells bearing the names of my aunts, cousins, parents, and sister, I placed gently into a woven basket beneath the table. They remained untouched, a physical, visible monument to the people who should have loved me most, but who made a deliberate choice to be somewhere else. At the end of the aisle stood the cedar arch Silas had built by hand. I walked up to it and ran my fingers over the wood. He had sourced the timber himself, sanding it down until it was smooth as glass. Every single joint was precise, fitted together with wooden pegs instead of metal screws. Every inch of that structure carried the meticulous care, the steadfast devotion, and the unyielding foundation that my family had continually refused to give me. It was built to weather any storm, just like the man who made it. Around noon, Delia Quinn arrived. Delia was my mentor at Halcyon, a woman in her late 50s who had spent 20 years as an emergency logistics chief before moving to the private sector. She had a face lined with the memory of 100 hurricanes and a demeanor composed entirely of steel and warmth. She found me standing on the porch, holding my dress in a garment bag. Delia did not offer me pity. She did not tilt her head and give me a sad, sympathetic smile. She simply walked up the steps, took the garment bag from my hands, and kissed my cheek. "The wind is holding steady from the east," Delia said, checking the horizon with a practiced eye. "It is going to be a gorgeous sunset. Let us get you ready. We have a structure to build today." She became the quiet, emotional anchor of the entire afternoon. When the makeup artist asked where the mother of the bride was, Delia seamlessly stepped in, claiming she was handling the duties for the day. She shielded me from the empty spaces in the house, filling the rooms with her commanding, comforting presence. When 4 o'clock arrived, the string quartet began to play a low, resonant melody. The guests, fewer than 30 people in total, took their seats. I stood at the beginning of the aisle. The traditional instinct, the one dictated by bridal magazines and societal expectations, would have been to ask Silas's father or perhaps an older friend to walk me down the aisle. I refused. I did not want a substitute. I did not want to stand in to mask the reality of my father's absence. I stepped onto the grass alone. I kept my back perfectly straight and my head held high. I looked at the empty wooden chairs in the second and third rows, acknowledging the void they represented, and then I looked past them to Silas. I refused to pretend I had not been abandoned, but I also refused to let that abandonment become my defining characteristic. I walked myself down the aisle, every step a deliberate transition from the family I was born into toward the family I was choosing to build. The ceremony was incredibly brief and stunningly honest. We did not recite fairy tale promises about effortless, unbroken happiness. Standing beneath the hand-carved cedar, with the marsh wind pulling at my veil, we spoke our vows centered entirely on weather, endurance, rebuilding, and choosing each other when all other structures failed. Silas held my hands, his thumbs tracing the knuckles of my fingers, his eyes completely locked onto mine, sealing a promise that required no audience to make it real. The reception that followed felt like taking a deep breath of clean air. There was no forced networking, no performative toasts designed to impress business associates. We hung warm string lights through the branches of the live oaks. We served roasted local oysters, crab cakes, and thick slices of sourdough bread on mismatched vintage plates. We played music from a portable speaker, the playlist shifting from classic soul to acoustic folk, depending on who had hold of the phone. The laughter that echoed across the lawn was genuine, loud, and unrestrained. I danced with Silas on the grass until the hem of my dress was stained with earth and dew. It was more honest, more deeply human, than anything the glossy, manufactured world of Conrad and Piper Hale had ever staged. It was well past midnight when Silas and I finally retired to the master suite of the property. He was in the bathroom, the sound of the shower running echoing softly against the tiles. I sat on the edge of the mattress, the room illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the sheer curtains. I picked up my phone from the dresser. I told myself not to look, but the compulsion was a heavy magnetic pull. I opened the social media application. There it was. The top of my feed was dominated by Piper's launch party. The images were bathed in the sharp, artificial glare of professional flash photography. There were towering champagne pyramids reflecting the Charlotte skyline. There were executives in sharp suits and women in designer gowns. And there, in the center of the third photograph, was my family. My father was holding a glass of scotch, beaming at the camera. My mother was standing beside Piper, looking flawlessly manicured and intensely proud. My aunts and cousins were clustered in the background, laughing. They all looked perfectly radiant. They were smiling as if the day held no other significance, as if my wedding day were just another opportunity for a photo op. They were smiling like my wedding had never happened at all. I stared at the glowing screen until the figures blurred together. I closed the application, turned the phone entirely off, and placed it face down in the dark. I listened to the steady sound of the water running in the next room, focusing on the solid, real life waiting for me, and let the hollow ghosts on the screen fade into the night. The days immediately following the wedding were characterized by an agonizing, deafening silence. One would think that after completely abandoning a daughter at the altar of their own ambition, a parent might muster the basic decency to send a text, a floral arrangement, or even a terribly worded email full of flimsy excuses. But there was absolutely nothing. For 5 consecutive days, my phone sat on the kitchen counter like a dead stone. There was no apology. There was no explanation. There was barely even a message pretending that nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. They simply went back to their lives, trusting that the sheer weight of their collective indifference would eventually force me to fall back into line. On the morning of the 6th day, I sat at the wooden dining table Silas had built for our new home. I opened the group thread on my phone that contained my parents, my sister, and her husband. I did not draft a long or emotional essay. I did not list my grievances or demand accountability from people fundamentally incapable of offering it. I typed a single, brief message. The ceremony was beautiful. Thank you all for making your priorities unmistakably clear. I will adjust mine accordingly. I hit send. It was calm. It was unforgettable in its brevity. I did not wait for the inevitable flurry of defensive replies. I deleted the thread from my phone immediately after, severing the digital cord with the same quiet precision Silas used when cutting through warped timber. I returned to work at Halcyon Civic Systems the following Monday, stepping into an atmosphere that was practically vibrating with unreleased tension. The corporate acquisition rumors that had been simmering beneath the surface for 6 months were finally boiling over into concrete reality. Meridian Atlas Group, a colossal global infrastructure and engineering firm with government contracts spanning 3 continents, had entered the final, aggressive stages of purchasing our company. They did not just want our client list or our regional goodwill. They wanted Tidemap, and they wanted it immediately. Delia pulled me into the glass-walled conference room along with our founder. The blinds were drawn, and the air conditioning hummed loudly against the absolute quiet of the room. Delia slid a thick, bound folder across the polished table toward me. The ink is officially drying on the term sheets, Delia told me, her voice low and steady. Meridian is folding Tidemap into their primary federal emergency logistics division. They are scaling the platform to cover every major vulnerable coastal zone on the eastern seaboard. And they want you positioned as a senior executive vice president to oversee the entire architectural integration. Our founder leaned forward, clasping his hands together. He looked at me with a mixture of profound pride and serious weight. You were here when we were eating cold noodles in a damp basement office. You built the core engine of this system. We are closing the deal on Friday. Your early equity shares are going to convert. Noel, you need to understand the scale of what is happening. You are about to have a very different kind of life. We were talking about a payout with 7 zeros. It was a sum of money that would permanently shift the gravitational pull of my future. It was the kind of financial leverage that would eclipse Conrad Hale's liquid assets on his very best financial quarter. For a fleeting, pathetic fraction of a second, the ghost of the old, desperate daughter inside me wanted to pick up the phone. I wanted to call my father and tell him I was not just a girl playing with regional weather maps. I wanted to prove to Piper that my life had massive, undeniable scale, but the urge died almost as instantly as it arose, replaced by a profound, heavy exhaustion. If I told them the truth, they would not suddenly respect my intellect or my years of grueling, unglamorous labor. They would only respect the commas in my bank account. They would immediately try to absorb my success into the family brand, utilizing my newly minted prestige to polish their own reflections. I chose absolute silence. I was completely done announcing my value to people who only recognized reflected prestige. Silas watched me navigate this strange, surreal limbo of private grief and massive professional triumph. He could see the anger humming beneath my skin. He knew exactly how tempting it was to let bitterness consume the first weeks of our marriage, to turn my newfound power into a weapon. But Silas was a builder, not a demolition expert. He refused to let the Hale family dictate the temperature of our home. "Leave them in the rearview mirror," Silas told me one evening, taking a damp cloth from my hands as I scrubbed the kitchen counter with unnecessary, frantic force. He wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. "We do not build our foundation on their wreckage. We rest now. We move forward. You won the race. Stop looking over your shoulder at people who are not even running." He pushed me toward rest, not retaliation. He grounded me in the physical reality of our life together, insisting on long walks by the water and quiet evenings on the porch, proving that our marriage was an entity entirely separate from my family's dysfunction. What I did not know then, but what the corporate market was already beginning to whisper, was that Piper's glittering Charlotte launch party was nothing but a staggeringly expensive illusion. The luxury botanical beverage brand she had touted as her founder-era masterpiece was critically underfunded. The champagne towers, the rooftop skyline views, the celebrity DJs. It was all paid for on aggressively borrowed credit. The entire spectacle was a desperate, hollow theater production designed specifically to dazzle nervous investors into opening their checkbooks before they looked too closely at the underlying financial models. Conrad's money, the supposed bedrock of my family's entire social existence, was stretched perilously thin. His latest boutique hotel developments were quietly hemorrhaging cash, caught in a suffocating web of bad supply chain logistics, soaring material costs, and aggressive loan terms. They needed that rooftop party to project absolute invincibility because, on paper, the Hale empire was quietly drowning in debt. Back in their manicured suburban bubble, Warren and Elise remained blissfully ignorant of both my impending ascent and Piper's hidden decay. They went to their country club dinners and charity luncheons, quietly assuming I would just swallow the insult of the wedding day like I had swallowed every other slight. They figured I would remain the overlooked daughter, comfortably tucked away in my modest marriage to the carpenter, nursing a quiet grudge they could eventually smooth over with a cheap holiday gift and a passive-aggressive apology. They were banking heavily on my historical predictability. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already shifted. 3 weeks after my wedding, the Halcyon acquisition officially closed. The payout was wired directly into a secure trust, and my new executive contract with Meridian Atlas Group was fully executed. As part of the leadership transition package, Meridian insisted on a mandatory strategic alignment retreat for the key executives. Because I had just gotten married, the corporate transition team seamlessly upgraded my requirement into a luxury honeymoon extension. They arranged for a private overwater villa in Bora Bora, completely covered by the firm, ostensibly to allow me to decompress before taking on the massive federal integration project. When the final itinerary arrived in my inbox, detailing private international flights, lagoon views, and absolute isolation from the noise of the mainland, I stared at the screen for a very long time. I had spent my entire existence shrinking my own desires to ensure my sister had enough room to expand her ego. I had always asked myself who my happiness would inconvenience before I allowed myself to feel it. Not this time. I forwarded the confirmation document to Silas with a single word attached to the email. Yes. I accepted the trip not as a calculated move on a chessboard, and certainly not as a petty act of revenge against a family that did not even know I was leaving the country. I accepted it because, for the first time in 32 years, I decided to choose pure, unfiltered joy without asking for permission, and without caring who it might eventually make uncomfortable. The flight from the mainland took 18 hours, carrying us across thousands of miles of deep, unbroken ocean. When Silas and I finally stepped onto the wooden dock in Bora Bora, the air wrapped around us like warm silk, heavy with the scent of wild vanilla and salt. Meridian Atlas Group had handled every logistical detail of the transition retreat, which had seamlessly morphed into our honeymoon. A private boat ferried us across a lagoon that was the exact, piercing color of crushed turquoise, delivering us to an overwater villa that sat completely isolated at the edge of a coral reef. The villa was a masterpiece of breathable architecture. It had expansive glass floors that revealed the vibrant marine life swimming beneath our feet, a thatched roof woven from native leaves, and a private infinity edge pool that seemed to spill directly into the South Pacific. It was a level of wealth I had never personally touched. But what made the luxury truly breathtaking was not the price tag attached to it. It was breathtaking because it existed in such stark, absolute contrast to the emotional scarcity I had grown up inside. In the Langley household, everything beautiful came with a hidden cost, a mandatory performance, or a desperate need for an audience. Here, the beauty simply existed, asking absolutely nothing of us in return. Silas unpacked our bags with his usual quiet efficiency. He did not pull out his phone to record a video of the sweeping ocean views to prove to strangers that he had arrived. Instead, he walked out onto the expansive deck, knelt down, and ran his hands along the seamlessly joined mahogany planks, appreciating the craftsmanship of the structure. He loved beauty deeply, but he had never worshipped status. That distinction made our time together feel profoundly intimate and deeply human. We spent our days swimming in the warm, clear water, eating fresh papaya and coconut on the deck, and sleeping without alarms. We existed without the suffocating pressure of a curated image. For the first time in my life, I was not holding my breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop or for someone to demand that I make myself smaller so they could shine brighter. On the evening of our fourth day, the sky put on a spectacular, bruised display of violet, gold, and deep crimson. We were sitting on the edge of the deck, our feet dangling in the water. Silas had his arm wrapped securely around my shoulders, his thumb tracing slow, grounding circles on my skin. I leaned my head against him, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was in that quiet, perfect moment that I thought about my family. They had skipped my wedding because they genuinely believed my life was insignificant. They had calculated the social yield of a modest coastal wedding against a glittering corporate launch party and decided I was not worth the investment. They never understood that a quiet life does not equate to a small one. They could not fathom that a person could build immense, undeniable power without constantly shouting about it from a rooftop. I reached for my phone, resting on the small teak table beside us. I opened the camera and snapped a single, unedited photograph. It captured the sprawling, fiery sunset reflecting off the lagoon, with the steady, reassuring silhouette of Silas sitting right beside me. I opened my social media application. I did not tag the luxury resort, nor did I tag Meridian Atlas Group. I did not mention the corporate acquisition or the massive payout that had secured this reality. I typed a simple caption, "Honeymoon, grateful for what stayed." I posted the image, placed the phone back down, and did not look at it for the rest of the night. I woke up the next morning at 6 o'clock, the tropical sun just beginning to filter through the linen curtains. Silas was still asleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. I picked up my phone to check the local weather forecast. The screen was an absolute avalanche. There were 74 unread text messages. There were 14 missed calls. The notification banner was a relentless, rolling wave of names from the exact people who had found it entirely impossible to carve out 3 hours for my wedding ceremony less than a month ago. I sat up against the pillows, pulling the white sheet over my chest, and began to read. The shift in their collective tone was so abrupt that it was almost comical. The silence they had weaponized against me for weeks had completely shattered, replaced by a frantic, suffocating panic. My father had sent 3 messages. The first was at midnight, his time. "Noel, sweetheart, beautiful picture. Are you in French Polynesia? Whose villa is that?" The second message came 2 hours later, clearly after he had spent time cross-referencing my location and my employer. "Just saw the business wire about Halcyon and Meridian Atlas Group. Call me the minute you wake up." My mother, Elise, had flooded my voicemail and sent a paragraph dripping with sudden, desperate affection. "Darling, we had no idea you were taking such a spectacular trip. The water looks divine. We must get together the absolute second you fly back. I want to host a proper, massive celebration dinner for you and Silas at the club. Let me know which weekend works." She wrote as if she had not explicitly asked me to cancel my wedding just weeks prior. Then there was Piper. My sister's messages were not celebratory. They were sharp, frantic, and barely contained her spiraling anxiety. "Saw your post. Cute. Also saw the press release about your little tech company. Did you know Meridian was buying them when we had dinner last month? Did your early stock options vest? Why did you not tell the family you were closing a deal like this? Call me." But the most revealing message of all came from Conrad. Conrad Hale, a man who had never once initiated a direct conversation with me in the 5 years he had been married to my sister, had sent me a direct text at 4 a.m. He did not ask about my well-being. He did not congratulate me on my marriage. He sensed a shift in the financial hierarchy, and like a shark detecting a single drop of blood in the water, he pivoted. "Noel," Conrad wrote, his tone dripping with an unearned, oily familiarity. "Meridian is a massive player. Congratulations on the executive transition. I have some significant coastal hospitality developments wrapping up next quarter. We should sit down when you are back stateside. There is likely some very lucrative synergy between your new infrastructure division and my real estate portfolio. Let us connect." I read every single message slowly. I let the words wash over me, analyzing the desperation hiding behind their sudden enthusiasm. A month ago, reading these messages might have given me a sick, hollow sense of validation. I might have felt a fleeting thrill that they finally saw my worth, but sitting in that villa, with the morning light pouring over the water, I felt something entirely different. I realized something profoundly important. The pain of their betrayal was still there. It still hurt that my father had abandoned me. It still hurt that my mother chose social currency over her daughter. But the desperate need for their approval was completely gone. I no longer needed them to validate my existence. I did not need Conrad's transactional respect, or Piper's jealous scrutiny, or my parents' conditional pride. I had built a solid, immovable foundation without them. I did not reply to Conrad. I did not call my father or my sister. I did not entertain my mother's pathetic attempt to rewrite history with a country club dinner. Instead, I opened the family group chat. I typed out one measured, emotionally detached response, ensuring my tone was as impenetrable as reinforced concrete. "Silas and I are doing very well. Yes, Halcyon was acquired, and my role has changed significantly. We are enjoying our time away. However, none of this erases or alters what happened at our wedding. We will see you when we see you." I locked the screen. I did not wait to see the typing bubbles appear. I slipped out of bed, walked out onto the sunlit deck, and dove into the clear, quiet water, leaving the noise of their panic far behind me. The corporate world moves with a ruthless efficiency that family dynamics rarely possess. Less than 48 hours after Silas and I returned to our home on the coast, the business media cycle caught hold of the Halcyon acquisition. It did not begin as a minor footnote on a tech blog. It debuted as a massive, multi-page feature in one of the most prestigious financial journals in the country. The headline was inescapable, detailing how Meridian Atlas Group had just spent an astronomical sum to acquire TideMap and the brilliant minds behind it. I was prominently identified as one of the 3 key architects of the platform. The journalist devoted an entire section to my background, detailing how the system I helped build was now being aggressively adopted across 6 different coastal states to overhaul their emergency response and municipal evacuation planning. The article formally announced my new title as Senior Executive Vice President of Regional Resilience within the merged corporate structure. Furthermore, the financial analysts contributing to the piece mapped out the equity conversion. They did not print my exact bank balance, but the numbers they attached to the executive payout were staggering enough to permanently shift my financial future into a stratosphere that made my family's country club posturing look like child's play. The magazine featured a full-page portrait of me. It was taken in our working warehouse weeks before the deal closed. I was standing in front of a sprawling digital projection map, wearing a tailored but understated navy blazer over a crisp white shirt. My hair pulled back, holding a stylus. I looked competent. I looked serious. I looked like a woman driven by a mission that genuinely mattered. Next to the aggressively retouched, glittering, hyper-curated images Piper constantly pushed into the world, my completely unadorned presence felt like an anchor dropping through a glass table. It made her entire version of family success look incredibly fragile and fundamentally shallow by comparison. The social shockwave hit my mother first. Elise Langley lived for her Tuesday charity luncheons at the club, a place where status was traded like currency over expensive salads. For years, she had weaponized Piper's proximity to Conrad's wealth to secure her seat at the absolute best tables. But on the Tuesday after the article dropped, the social temperature in the dining room shifted dramatically. The women she had spent her life trying to impress had all read the business journal. They wanted to know everything about Elise's brilliant, powerful daughter. And inevitably, because high society thrives on sniffing out discrepancies, the math stopped adding up for them. They began asking quiet, razor-sharp questions. If Noelle was this successful, why was her wedding held in total obscurity? Why were there no photographs of the family celebrating with her? Why did the Langley family attend a crowded rooftop party for a beverage brand instead of their own daughter's marriage ceremony? My mother tried to laugh it off, offering vague, airy excuses about scheduling conflicts and modern, independent daughters, but the women saw right through her. Elise sat there, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly around her iced tea glass, feeling the undeniable, humiliating reality that everyone in the room now knew exactly which daughter she had publicly undervalued. She had bet all her chips on a shiny facade, and her peers were now praising the steady foundation she had actively ignored. Piper, sensing the narrative slipping violently from her grasp, went into overdrive. I heard from my cousin Mia that Piper was frantically trying to rewrite history within her social circle. Whenever the topic of my new executive role came up, Piper would force a tight, polished smile and call the wedding absence a tragic misunderstanding. She started telling people that she had practically begged me to move my date so the whole family could celebrate together, framing herself as the victim of bad timing and immovable investors. But the lie was weakening rapidly, and she knew it. Her friends had seen how she paraded around that launch party, demanding absolute loyalty. The contradiction was spreading like a hairline crack through every carefully curated story she had ever told, threatening to shatter her entire brand of effortless superiority. My father's reaction was entirely different. Warren Langley read the media coverage in his home office, sitting in absolute silence for hours. He did not call me. He did not text. He was a man who had built his entire identity around the pursuit of prestige, constantly seeking Conrad's approval just to feel important. Looking at the financial journal, reading the words describing his youngest daughter as a leading industry visionary, the weight of his failure finally crushed him. He realized, far too late, that while he was desperately chasing the borrowed, conditional prestige of his son-in-law, the daughter he had treated as completely optional had been quietly building something meaningful, permanent, and vastly more powerful. But the cleanest reversal came directly from Conrad Hale. Conrad never apologized, because men who operate purely on leverage view apologies as a surrender of capital. Instead, he attempted a pivot. 4 days after the article circulated, he sent a message to my new, secure corporate email address. His tone was a masterful display of forced casualness, completely abandoning the condescending smirk he usually reserved for me. Noel. His email read, "Incredible news on the Meridian transition. I always knew Halcyon had legs. I have a few major hospitality developments hitting zoning snags on the coast next quarter. The municipal boards are getting tight on flood compliance. I think there is a highly lucrative opportunity for Meridian to partner with my firm on some hospitality resilience consulting. Let us grab a quiet dinner this weekend to discuss." He was trying to use the back door. He assumed that because he was married to my sister, he still held the right to bypass the rules. He wanted to leverage my new institutional power to smooth over the structural messes he had created in his own portfolio, expecting me to fall back into the role of the compliant, helpful sister-in-law. I sat at my desk in my new corner office, looking at the city skyline, and felt a profound, settling calm. I did not reply to his email. I did not give him the satisfaction of an angry rejection or a self-righteous lecture on morality. Instead, I forwarded his message to Sarah, my newly assigned executive assistant. I gave Sarah very specific instructions. 10 minutes later, Conrad received his reply. "Dear Mr. Hale," Sarah wrote on my behalf, "thank you for reaching out to Meridian Atlas Group. Vice President Langley's schedule is currently at full capacity for the upcoming quarter, and she is unavailable for informal consultations. If your firm requires resilience compliance support, please submit your structural blueprints, environmental impact studies, and financial disclosures to our regional intake portal for standard bureaucratic review. A junior associate will be assigned to evaluate your file within 6 to 8 weeks. It was a flawlessly executed corporate dismissal. It was the very first time in my life that Conrad Hale was forced to approach me not as the manageable, insignificant family member, but as an executive holding real, undeniable power. I completely removed his access. I forced him to stand in line like everyone else, stripping him of the one thing he valued most in the world. I took away his privilege. Karma operates with a terrifying mathematical precision. It does not always announce itself with a thunderclap. Sometimes, it simply tightens around you like a wire, millimeter by millimeter, until you can no longer breathe. For the Hale family, the wire began to snap violently in the second week of November. Conrad Hale had built his entire reputation on the illusion of infinite liquidity and unstoppable momentum. But real estate development on a shifting coastline is brutally unforgiving, and the ocean does not care about your tailored suits or your country club handicap. His flagship boutique hotel expansion, a $90 million project meant to cement his legacy, ran headfirst into a wall of environmental and financial reality. The municipal building codes had been aggressively updated in the wake of recent storms. Conrad's architects, instructed to maximize the square footage for luxury cabanas and ground floor retail, had completely ignored the new flood zone design parameters. When the structural blueprints were submitted for final review, the county flagged dozens of catastrophic code violations. The foundation was sitting in a designated high-risk velocity zone. The commercial insurance actuaries took one look at the revised flood models and refused to underwrite the property without a 400% premium increase, an expense that would instantly bankrupt the operating budget. By the end of the month, the institutional lenders panicked. They halted all construction draws and demanded hard, immediate answers to salvage their investment. Conrad's leverage was choking him. As Conrad's empire began to fracture, the truth about my sister's spectacular launch party finally clawed its way to the surface. It became horrifyingly clear that Piper's event on my wedding day had never been a celebration of strength. It was a glossy, desperate distraction. It was a wildly expensive smokescreen designed to blind her social circle to how violently unstable their finances really were. Her luxury botanical beverage brand failed entirely to secure the Series A investor backing she had spent 6 months bragging about. The venture capitalists drank the free champagne, posed for the photographers, and then politely declined to fund a company that possessed zero actual business infrastructure. Piper was left holding the bag. She had no distribution network, crippling high-interest debt, and 40,000 bottles of rapidly expiring inventory sitting in a climate-controlled warehouse that was costing her $15,000 a month. The collapse of the Hale financial shield had an immediate, devastating ripple effect on my parents. For years, Warren Langley had enjoyed a lucrative, entirely ceremonial consulting arrangement with a logistics firm tied to Conrad's primary lending network. It was an $80,000 a year vanity position given to him simply for being Conrad's father-in-law. That contract was quietly and ruthlessly terminated overnight. My mother, Elise, felt the freeze just as quickly. Her access to the Hale lifestyle evaporated as if it had never existed. The country club dues went unpaid, and the exclusive invitations to sit on elite charity boards mysteriously stopped arriving in the mail. Elise's entire identity was predicated on her proximity to money, and without Conrad's black card to underwrite her social maneuvering, she was completely adrift, stripped of their protective layer of borrowed prestige. My family suddenly rediscovered my existence with startling speed. The profound, arrogant silence that had followed my wedding was instantly replaced by a frantic, cloying barrage of attention. They did not apologize. They did not admit that their relentless social climbing had resulted in a catastrophic fall. Instead, they completely rebranded their financial ruin. They started calling their situation a hard season. It was a brilliant, manipulative phrase designed to absolve them of all accountability. By framing their collapse as a hard season, they acted as if their current crisis was an unpredictable act of nature rather than the direct, unavoidable consequence of their own arrogance and negligence. Elise finally managed to reach me on a Tuesday evening, calling my personal cell phone from a blocked number so I could not screen the call. Her voice trembled with a manufactured, delicate fragility. "Darling," my mother breathed into the receiver, her tone dripping with false warmth. "We have been so terribly disconnected lately. The family is going through such a very hard season right now. I was hoping you and Silas would come to the house for dinner this Friday. We really need to heal. We need to put the past behind us and just be a family again." The wording made my stomach turn. It was transparently manipulative. She did not want honesty. She wanted an alliance. She wanted access to my new financial and institutional gravity, and she was trying to use the concept of healing as a Trojan horse to secure it before the rest of their world collapsed. But the true depth of their audacity did not become apparent until the following afternoon. Conrad, realizing that his standard methods of intimidation would no longer work on me, bypassed my corporate gatekeepers by sending a courier directly to my home. He sent a sealed architectural dossier. Inside was a desperate plea disguised as a synergistic business proposal. Conrad did not just want a quiet loan to float his debts. He wanted something vastly more valuable. He wanted my reputation. His doomed hotel project was facing a critical, highly publicized county zoning hearing on the 14th of December. He needed a municipal waiver to bypass the new flood regulations, or the lenders would officially foreclose on the property. Conrad was formally asking me to stand up at that public hearing, utilizing my new title as a senior executive vice president at Meridian Atlas Group, to publicly validate his fundamentally flawed flood models. He wanted me to use my hard-earned expertise and my pristine industry name to calm the nervous county officials and explicitly support his project. An hour after the courier arrived, Piper sent me a long, rambling text message that completely ignored the technical and ethical reality of what her husband was asking me to do. "I know things have been complicated between us," Piper wrote, entirely minimizing the fact that she had maliciously orchestrated a family boycott of my wedding vows. "But Conrad's project is the only thing keeping us afloat right now. We are all making massive sacrifices. Family should show up for family now that things are so complicated. We really need you in our corner, and I know you will do the right thing." I read the text message while standing in my kitchen, watching Silas run a piece of sandpaper over a reclaimed oak shelf. A cold, brutal clarity washed over me. The realization settled into my bones like lead. They were still not reaching for my humanity. They did not miss my laugh, or my perspective, or my presence at the dinner table. They did not care about the woman who had stood under a cedar arch with a broken heart. They were reaching exclusively for my usefulness. I had simply transitioned from being the reliable, invisible stagehand who cleaned up their messes in private to the powerful corporate executive who could clean up their messes in public. I looked at the thick architectural dossier sitting on the granite counter. I knew exactly how dangerous Conrad's blueprints were, because my own tide map software had modeled the storm surge projections for that exact stretch of coastline. Helping him would require me to lie. It would require me to compromise my ethics, to endanger the future residents of that development, and to betray the very work that had finally set me free. I picked up my phone and opened the message thread with my mother. I agreed to meet them for dinner on Friday. I was not going there to rescue them. I was not going there to offer them a financial lifeline or a professional shield. I was going to walk into that dining room, sit across from the people who had abandoned me, and hear exactly how much of the truth they were still willing to deny. The heavy oak front door of my parents' house opened before Silas even had the chance to press the brass doorbell. Elise stood in the foyer, wearing a cashmere cardigan draped over her shoulders like a protective shield. She looked thinner, her usual perfectly curated posture replaced by a calculated, trembling fragility. She reached out to hug me, her fingers digging desperately into my arms. I let her, but I did not squeeze back. In the dining room, the atmosphere was thick with an unearned, desperate familiarity. Piper sprang up from the mahogany table the second we walked in. She wore a soft, neutral-toned sweater, entirely abandoning her usual sharp, designer armor. She offered a wide, overly bright smile and tried to hand Silas a glass of expensive red wine. He politely declined, pouring himself a glass of water instead. Conrad sat at the head of the table, completely skipping his usual condescending smirk, attempting to project the pragmatic aura of a businessman simply looking to finalize a merger. And then there was Warren. My father stared down at his empty plate, his shoulders slumped, carrying the distinct, heavy physical posture of a man who was already deeply ashamed of himself. Nobody touched the roasted chicken Elise had prepared. The pleasantries lasted exactly 4 minutes before the desperation swallowed the room whole. Conrad folded his hands together on the table, leaning forward to initiate the transaction. "We appreciate you coming," he began, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance, replaced by a hollow urgency. "I am going to speak plainly. The market has shifted. The lenders are panicking over the new coastal compliance regulations. My firm is facing a severe liquidity crunch. Elise and Warren have also taken a substantial hit. We need a bridge." Elise nodded, her eyes wide and wet. "Just until things stabilize, darling, we are all making massive sacrifices." They quickly laid out the exact parameters of their demands. They wanted a capital injection, a short-term loan of $500,000 from my newly converted equity to satisfy Conrad's creditors. They wanted formal introductions to Meridian Atlas Group executives to secure future government contracts, but most importantly, the true crown jewel of their pitch. They desperately needed my public support. Conrad's hotel expansion project was hanging by a thread. He needed me to stand in front of the county zoning board next Thursday, using my credential as a senior executive vice president of regional resilience, to testify that his current flood models were perfectly sound. Piper reached across the table, attempting to place her hand over mine. I smoothly pulled my hand back, letting her fingers land on the bare wood. "We know things have been messy," Piper said, wrapping her voice in a thick layer of artificial warmth. "But family has to pull together when things get complicated. What happened with your wedding and my launch? It was just a terrible misunderstanding. The dates got crossed. The investors forced my hand. We just have to let the past go and move forward to save the family." I did not raise my voice. I did not sigh. I simply reached into the leather tote bag resting at my feet and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila folder. I opened it and placed it squarely in the center of the dining table. "There was no misunderstanding," I said, my voice as flat and smooth as a sheet of ice. "And the dates did not simply get crossed." I slid the first sheet of paper toward her. It was a printed screenshot. "On the second Tuesday of February, I announced my wedding date in the main family group chat. You replied with a heart emoji. 14 days later, you signed the venue contract for your Charlotte rooftop party, selecting the exact same Saturday." I slid the next set of papers forward, fanning them out like a deck of cards. "These are the call logs and text records from Aunt Clara, Cousin Mia, and Uncle David. On the first Monday of September, you personally called every single member of our extended family. You told them that Conrad was keeping a strict ledger of who supported your launch. You explicitly told them that choosing my wedding over your party would result in Conrad cutting their access to his professional network. You weaponized his money to empty out my ceremony." Piper's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The artificial warmth instantly vanished from her face, replaced by a pale, cornered panic. She looked at Conrad for help, but he was staring at the documents, his jaw clenched tight. I turned my gaze to my father. He refused to look at the papers. He kept his eyes locked on his hands, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. "Tell me about the sudden board meeting you had." "Dad," I said quietly. "The one you claimed kept you from walking me down the aisle." The room fell into an agonizing silence. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen suddenly sounded like a roaring engine. Warren closed his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked, the sound of a man breaking under the weight of his own cowardice. "There was no board meeting," my father whispered, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "Conrad told me that if I did not stand next to Piper in Charlotte, he would pull my consulting contract. He told me the country club dues would stop." I panicked. "I convinced myself that your wedding was small, that Silas would not care, and that I could just buy you a nice gift later to smooth it over. I chose the status. I chose the money. And I have hated myself every single day since." It was the first piece of absolute, unfiltered truth my father had spoken in 10 years, but it was not enough to save them. Conrad, sensing the emotional collapse of his father-in-law, aggressively cleared his throat. He tried to steer the ship back to the transaction, completely dismissing the human wreckage laid out on the table. "Warren made a poor judgment call," Conrad stated coldly, entirely ignoring his own role in the blackmail. "And Piper was overly zealous about her brand. Mistakes were made. But none of that changes the macroeconomic reality we are sitting in right now. The hotel project is a $90 million asset. It anchors this entire family. I am willing to offer you a formal consulting fee for your testimony at the hearing. Just review the structural plans and give the county the technical sign-off." I looked at the man who had treated me like dirt for half a decade, feeling the absolute thrill of moral clarity settling over me. "I do not need to review your structural plans, Conrad," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "I already reviewed them 7 months ago." Conrad froze. The arrogant pragmatism completely evaporated from his eyes, leaving behind genuine confusion. "What are you talking about?" 7 months ago, a preliminary environmental impact memo for your coastal development circulated through the regional infrastructure network," I explained, watching the blood drain from his face. "Halcyon was contracted by the state to run random municipal audits. I was the lead architect on that audit. I ran your exact blueprints through the tide map system, and I filed a formal, documented warning with the State Planning Commission stating that your flood risk models were dangerously weak. The foundation sits directly in a high-risk velocity zone," Elise gasped, pressing her hand over her mouth. Silas sat perfectly still beside me, a silent, immovable guard. "You knew the models were flawed," I continued, my voice sharp and unrelenting. "The state forwarded you my audit. You completely ignored the warning because upgrading the foundation to comply with the safety standards would have cost you an additional $3 million and delayed the project by 8 months. You buried the report." You chose to roll the dice with the lives of future residents to protect your profit margin. This is not a hard season. This is arrogant, calculated negligence. Conrad opened his mouth to argue, to deploy some kind of corporate spin, but he had absolutely nothing. He was completely out of leverage. You are asking me to stand up in a public forum and commit perjury. I told him, you are asking me to endanger innocent people, destroy the integrity of my software, and betray every single moral principle my career stands for, just so you do not have to declare bankruptcy. That was the breaking point. Piper slammed her hands down on the table, her chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor as she stood up. The fragile, warm sister act shattered into a million pieces, revealing the vicious, entitled core beneath it. You are enjoying this, Piper screamed, her face flushed with a furious, ugly red. You sat there for years pretending to be the sweet, supportive sister, and the second you get a little bit of money and a fancy title, you use it to destroy us. You are humiliating your own family. You could fix this with one 10-minute speech at that hearing, but you would rather watch us lose everything just to settle a petty grudge about a wedding. I did not stand up to match her energy. I did not yell. I remained seated, looking up at my older sister with a calm that was far more devastating than her rage. I am not humiliating you, Piper, I said, delivering the words with absolute, unwavering finality. And I am not destroying you. I have simply stopped protecting you from the consequences of your own choices. I stood up, signaling to Silas that we were leaving. I did not take the manila folder with me. I left the evidence of their betrayal sitting right next to their untouched dinner. As we walked out of the dining room and headed for the front door, the silence behind us was absolute, heavy, and completely broken. The county zoning board convened in a sterile, fluorescent-lit civic auditorium on the morning of the 14th of December. Despite the brutal reality of the situation, my family arrived operating under a deeply entrenched, staggering delusion. They genuinely believed that, at the absolute final second, blood would compel me to rescue them. Conrad sat at the petitioner's table surrounded by 3 expensive corporate attorneys. They were casually shuffling thick stacks of paper, projecting the relaxed confidence of men who believed the fix was already in. Piper sat in the second row of the public gallery. She was dressed meticulously for optics, wearing a tailored navy blue blazer and a modest pearl necklace, performing the role of the dignified, supportive founder wife for the local press and the nervous lenders sitting a few rows back. When the board chairman called my name, I stood up from my seat in the back row. Silas squeezed my hand once, a silent anchor, before letting me go. I walked down the center aisle and took my place at the witness microphone. I adjusted it, looking directly at the 5 board members seated on the elevated dais. Please state your name and professional capacity for the record, the chairman said, his voice echoing through the quiet room. My name is Noelle Langley. I am the Senior Executive Vice President of Regional Resilience at Meridian Atlas Group and the lead systems architect behind the TideMap emergency logistics platform. I did not look at Conrad. I did not look at Piper. I opened my leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The development proposed by Mr. Hale's firm relies on environmental risk models that are fundamentally incompatible with reality, I stated, my voice calm, steady, and echoing with absolute precision. I have independently reviewed the site plan, flood risk assumptions, and evacuation modeling. The foundation of this $90 million project sits squarely within a designated high-risk velocity zone. Furthermore, the primary exit corridor would strand more than 300 vehicles during a Category 3 weather event. Upgrading the foundation to meet basic safety compliance would require an additional $3 million in concrete pilings and a delay of 8 to 12 months. Approving this waiver today would not just be an administrative oversight. It would be an act of gross negligence that places the lives of future residents at immediate, catastrophic risk. I did not speak with rage. I did not raise my voice or point fingers. I delivered the unvarnished, mathematical truth. And because I spoke with the icy precision of an expert rather than the heat of a vengeful sister, The truth landed harder than any dramatic speech never could have. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, deafening, and final. I closed my portfolio, thanked the board for their time, and walked back up the aisle. I could feel Piper staring at me, her perfectly curated posture completely collapsing. I could hear the frantic whispering of Conrad's attorneys as their entire defense evaporated into thin air. 30 minutes later, the board chairman struck his wooden gavel. The municipal waiver was unanimously denied. The project was officially dead. The lenders sitting in the gallery immediately stood up and walked out, taking Conrad's financial future with them. Piper was forced to stand in the wreckage of a massive, public crisis that she had fully expected me to clean up for her. Silas and I walked out into the crisp December air. We were halfway to our truck when I heard footsteps behind us. It was my father. Warren Langley looked 10 years older than he had at the dinner table the week before. The false bravado was entirely gone. He stopped a few feet away from us, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his overcoat. He did not try to hug me. He did not offer any desperate excuses about bad timing or aggressive sons-in-law. "I am sorry." "Noel," my father said, his voice entirely stripped of performance. "I chose a country club and a shiny car over my own daughter. I abandoned you on your wedding day because I was a coward. I know exactly what I did. I do not expect you to ever forgive me, and I am not asking you to fix this. I just need you to know that it is the greatest regret of my life." It was clear, it was specific. There was no pressure for reconciliation. I looked at him, seeing the broken man beneath the least luxury suits, and I gave him a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. Then, Silas and I got into our truck and drove away. I did not speak to my family for the next 4 months. During that time, Conrad's creditors foreclosed on his properties. Piper's beverage brand was officially liquidated, and they were forced to sell their $5 million home just to cover the legal fees of their bankruptcy. My parents lost their sprawling house to the bank exactly 6 weeks later, but I had evolved past the need for pure, destructive vengeance. I did not want my parents living on the street, but I absolutely refused to step back into the role of the family safety net, and I certainly refused to fund Conrad's debts or finance Piper's hollow image. Instead, I made one final, unexpected move. Through my corporate attorney, utilizing a blind trust that could not be traced directly back to me, I arranged a downsizing bridge plan for my parents. I purchased a very modest 2-bedroom condominium in a quiet working-class suburb an hour away from the coast. I set up a strict, unbreakable monthly stipend that covered their basic utilities and groceries. It was enough to keep them stable and safe, but it was completely locked down and absolutely beyond Piper and Conrad's reach. They were forced to live a quiet, unremarkable life, exactly the kind of life they used to mock. By the time the spring weather finally broke, Silas and I had closed on a historic coastal home with a massive detached barn. Silas converted the barn into his primary woodworking shop, filling the space with the smell of cut pine and the steady hum of his machinery. Inside the house, he built a dining room table out of reclaimed, solid oak. It was 12 feet long, heavy enough to withstand an earthquake, and surrounded by 12 sturdy chairs. We filled those chairs every single Sunday. Delia became a permanent fixture in our home, bringing bottles of wine and loud, genuine laughter. We hosted our true friends, my colleagues from Meridian, and the neighbors who actually knew our names. We built a life filled with people who showed up, people who did not require a luxury invitation to sit at our table. The final closure arrived on a Tuesday in late May, in the form of a handwritten letter delivered to my mailbox. The return address belonged to a cheap apartment complex in Charlotte. It was from Piper. It was not a demand for money, nor was it a threat. It was the absolute, raw truth, bleeding through the blue ink. "I chose that date on purpose," my sister wrote, her handwriting lacking its usual arrogant flourish. "I knew exactly what I was doing. I saw you and Silas building a life that was so incredibly steady, so undeniably real, and it terrified me. My entire life was a performance. My marriage, my brand, my money, it was all hollow. I knew that if everyone stood around you on your wedding day and saw your happiness, they would realize how incredibly empty mine was. I tried to erase your day because I could not stand the thought of being exposed. You did not destroy me, Noel. I destroyed myself. I read the letter twice. I felt a brief, passing wave of pity for the woman who had spent her entire existence chasing a spotlight that ultimately burned her to the ground. Then, I folded the paper, walked into the kitchen, and dropped it into the recycling bin. I walked into the dining room and ran my hand along the smooth, polished edge of the oak table Silas had built. For the first time in 32 years, I had defined my worth by the empty spaces my family left behind. I had measured my life by who was missing. But standing there, listening to the sound of Silas whistling in his workshop out back, the weight of the past finally lifted completely. At last, I stopped counting the people who abandoned me, and I started counting only the people who stayed. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment down below with your city or country so we can connect and share our thoughts on Noel's journey. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to Helena Revenge Stories, leave a like on the video, and support the channel by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.